Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This is not simply a story about a drug. This is not merely a tale of chemistry and medicine, of molecules and prescriptions. No, this is a story about the very nature of human suffering and our desperate eternal quest to escape it. For as long as humanity has known pain, we have searched for relief. And when we finally found it, when we at last extracted from nature a substance so powerful it could silence the screams of the wounded and calm the tormented mind, we unleashed something that would claim more lives than most wars in human history. Morphine, the name itself, whispers of dreams. Named for Morpheus, the Greek god who shaped the visions of sleeping mortals, this crystalline white powder has been called the greatest blessing ever bestowed upon suffering humanity, and simultaneously its most cunning curse. It has saved countless millions from unimaginable agony. It has allowed surgeons to cut through flesh and bone while patients rested in peaceful oblivion. It has granted the dying a gentle passage from this world into the next. But it has also destroyed families, bankrupted nations, fueled criminal empires, and turned ordinary people into hollow vessels, enslaved to an insatiable chemical hunger. The toll is staggering. In the United States alone, more than 1 million people have died from opioid overdoses since the late 1990s. Globally, opioids claim tens of thousands of lives each year. And yet, morphine remains essential to modern medicine, listed by the World Health Organization as one of the most fundamental medicines any healthcare system requires. How can one substance embody such profound contradiction? How did humanity's greatest tool against pain become one of its greatest sources of suffering? These are the questions that will guide us through the centuries tonight, from ancient poppy fields to modern emergency rooms, from battlefield hospitals to suburban bedrooms. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you find this journey worthwhile. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from tonight and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated to know who is traveling through history alongside me, whether you are lying awake in London at 3 in the morning or settling into evening somewhere across the Pacific. Now, phone away. Distractions silenced, let us begin. In the beginning, there was pain, and there was the poppy. Our story begins not in a laboratory, not in a pharmacy, not in a hospital ward, but in the sun-baked river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent where civilization itself first root took. The year, as best as archaeologists can determine, is approximately 3,400 years before the Common Era. The Sumerians, that remarkable people who gave humanity its first written language, its first cities, its first organized governments, had already discovered something extraordinary growing in their fields. Picture the scene if you can. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers stretches before you, a patchwork of irrigation canals and carefully tended plots. The air is thick with the heat of the Mesopotamian summer, and among the barley and the wheat, rising on slender stems, are the most beautiful flowers you have ever seen. They bloom in shades of white and pale purple and deep crimson, their delicate petals catching the morning light. These are the poppies, Papaver somniferum, and the Sumerians have given them a name that would echo through millennia, Hulgil, the joy plant. The Sumerians understood, perhaps better than any civilization that followed for thousands of years, exactly what they had found. They recorded on clay tablets in that distinctive wedge-shaped script called cuneiform the methods for harvesting this remarkable plant. They knew to wait until the petals had fallen from the seed pod. They knew to make careful incisions in the green surface of that pod, to allow the milky white sap to ooze forth and dry into a brownish resin. They knew that this substance, collected and processed, could ease suffering unlike anything else in nature. And they traded it. Along the ancient routes that connected Mesopotamia to Egypt and beyond, the joy plant spread. Merchants carried not just the dried latex, which we would come to call opium, but the seeds themselves, the very knowledge of cultivation. It was perhaps humanity's first pharmaceutical export, the first medicine to become a commodity of international trade. The first chapter of this story takes us across the ancient world, following opium as it spreads from culture to culture, each civilization discovering anew its remarkable powers and its hidden dangers. In Egypt, we find evidence of opium use dating to approximately 1,500 years before the Common Era, during the reign of Thutmose IV and his successors of the 18th dynasty. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest and most important medical documents ever discovered, contains more than 700 remedies for various ailments. Among them are several preparations involving what scholars believe to be opium, recommended for quieting crying children and easing the pain of various afflictions. Egyptian physicians, those learned men who served the pharaohs and the noble houses, kept opium among their most valued medicines. Imagine the households of ancient Thebes, the great capital of Upper Egypt. Mothers, desperate to soothe colicky infants, administered carefully prepared solutions of opium. The elderly, their bodies worn by labor and time, found in these preparations a merciful relief from the aches that plagued their final years. Priests in the great temples may have used opium in religious rituals, inducing visions and prophetic dreams. The line between medicine and magic was not yet drawn, and opium seemed to partake of both. But we must move forward in time and space to the sun-drenched islands and peninsulas of ancient Greece, where opium would find new admirers and new applications. The Greeks called it opos, from which our word opium ultimately derives, meaning simply juice or sap. They recognized its divine qualities, associating it with Hypnos, the god of sleep, with Nyx, the goddess of night, and of course with Morpheus, who shaped the dreams of sleeping mortals. Statues and images from the classical period show these deities crowned with poppies, holding poppy pods, surrounded by the flowers of sweet oblivion. The great physicians of Greece studied opium with careful attention. Hippocrates of Kos, that father of Western medicine who gave us the oath that doctors still take today, wrote of the poppy's usefulness in treating disease and promoting sleep. He recommended what he called meconium, the juice of the poppy, for various conditions, including what we might today recognize as hysteria, internal diseases, and epidemics. However, Hippocrates was cautious. He observed that the substance must be used with care, that its powers were not without risk. Some centuries later, in the great multicultural city of Alexandria, where Greek learning merged with Egyptian tradition and knowledge from distant lands, the use of opium became more sophisticated and more widespread. The physician Herophilus, who performed the first systematic dissections of human bodies and is credited with many discoveries about anatomy, prescribed opium liberally. Some of his colleagues criticized him for this, suggesting that he relied too heavily on its powers. But it was Galen of Pergamon, perhaps the most influential physician after Hippocrates himself, who would truly establish opium's place in Western medicine. Galen served as personal physician to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and he observed something remarkable about his patient. The emperor, who wrote his famous Meditations on the nature of virtue and endurance, was himself dependent upon a preparation called theriac, an elaborate concoction containing opium as its primary active ingredient. Theriac had originated as an antidote to poisons, its name derived from the Greek word for wild beast, as it was first developed to treat venomous bites. Over the centuries, its recipe had grown increasingly complex, including dozens of herbs, minerals, honey, wine, and always opium. By Galen's time, theriac had become something of a cure-all, prescribed for everything from headaches to plague, and the quantities of opium it contained were considerable. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king whose writings on stoic acceptance of fate remain beloved today, took his theriac daily. When he attempted to reduce or eliminate his use, Galen observed, the emperor became irritable, unable to sleep, afflicted with various uncomfortable symptoms. The great physician recognized what was happening. He was watching, in the person of one of history's most celebrated minds, what we would today call withdrawal. Marcus Aurelius was addicted to opium. This pattern would repeat itself through the centuries that followed, the powerful, the wealthy, the learned, finding in opium a refuge from the burdens of existence, only to discover that the refuge had become a prison. But we must not yet leap forward in time. There is much ground to cover, many cultures to explore, before we reach the moment when opium would yield its most potent secret. While opium was spreading through the Mediterranean world, it was also moving eastward, carried by traders along the routes that connected Rome to India and beyond. Arab merchants, those master navigators of desert and sea, played a crucial role in this diffusion. They brought opium to Persia, where it was valued both as medicine and as a substance of recreation. They carried it to the Indian subcontinent, where it would become intertwined with local medical traditions, and eventually, through complex networks of trade and conquest, opium would reach China. The Arab physicians of the Islamic Golden Age, that remarkable period from the 8th to the 14th centuries, when Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba became centers of learning unmatched in the world, studied opium with systematic attention. Avicenna, known in the Arab world as Ibn Sina, was perhaps the greatest physician of this era. His masterwork, The Canon of Medicine, compiled in the early 11th century, remained the primary medical textbook in both the Islamic world and European universities for nearly 600 years. Avicenna wrote extensively about opium. He described its effects with precision, its ability to induce sleep, to calm the agitated mind, to relieve pain of every kind. He prescribed it for numerous conditions: diarrhea, coughs, sleeplessness, eye pain. But Avicenna also issued warnings. He observed that extended use of opium led to tolerance, requiring ever larger doses to achieve the same effect. He noted that those who stopped taking it suddenly became ill, experiencing symptoms he carefully catalogued: running eyes and nose, extreme restlessness, inability to sleep, a profound misery of both body and mind. This was, more than a millennium ago, a clear clinical description of opioid addiction and withdrawal. Avicenna understood, perhaps as well as any modern scientist, the double nature of this substance. He saw that it was both medicine and poison, that the line between them was determined by wisdom, by restraint, by luck. Would that subsequent generations had heeded his warnings. The second chapter of this story takes us across a great transformation from the medieval world into the age of exploration and discovery, when European powers would begin their fateful interventions in the global opium trade. In the centuries following the fall of Rome, opium use continued throughout Europe, though at perhaps lower levels than in the ancient world. The substance remained available, imported primarily through Venice and other Italian trading cities that maintained connections with the Eastern Mediterranean. Physicians prescribed it, apothecaries stocked it, but it was the Renaissance and the age that followed that would see opium assume new forms and new importance. Enter Paracelsus, one of the most controversial figures in the history of medicine. Born Theophrastus von Hohenheim in 1493 in what is now Switzerland, he adopted the name Paracelsus as a boast, declaring himself superior to the ancient Roman physician Celsus. He was arrogant, abrasive, frequently drunk, and absolutely brilliant. Paracelsus rejected much of classical medical theory. He burned the books of Galen and Avicenna in public bonfires, declaring that his own shoe buckles knew more about medicine than those ancient authorities. He insisted on direct observation and experimentation. He pioneered the use of chemistry in medicine, and among his many innovations was a preparation he called laudanum. The word comes from the Latin laudare, to praise, and Paracelsus praised his creation extravagantly, calling it the stone of immortality, claiming it could cure almost any disease. His original formula was secret and is still debated by historians, but it certainly included opium dissolved in alcohol, along with various other ingredients that may have included gold, pearls, and several herbs. Paracelsus carried his laudanum always in the hollow pommel of his sword. He administered it to patients with an almost reckless confidence. Some historians believe that his own death, at the age of 47, under somewhat mysterious circumstances, may have been related to his enthusiastic self-medication with his own creation. But the idea of laudanum survived its creator. In 1660, the English physician Thomas Sydenham developed his own version, a formula that would become standardized and widespread. Sydenham's laudanum contained opium dissolved in sherry wine with the addition of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves. It was simple to prepare, relatively consistent in strength, and remarkably effective. Thomas Sydenham, often called the English Hippocrates, was a careful clinician who believed in treating symptoms rather than theoretical imbalances. And for symptom relief, he found nothing superior to opium. Among the remedies which it has pleased Almighty God to give to man to relieve his sufferings, none is so universal and so efficacious as opium, Sydenham wrote. Sydenham's laudanum became wildly popular. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, it spread through British society at every level. The wealthy kept elegantly crafted bottles of the reddish-brown liquid in their medicine cabinets. The poor purchased penny packets of the cheaper formulations. Mothers dosed their children. Artists and poets sought inspiration in its dreams. The sick and the healthy alike found in laudanum a reliable source of comfort and calm. The substance was legal. socially acceptable, and viewed as essentially harmless if used with reasonable moderation. Addiction occurred, of course, but it was generally discussed in moral terms rather than medical ones. Those who became dependent were thought to lack willpower, to be of weak character. The idea that the substance itself might create an irresistible physical need was not widely accepted. However, something was changing. As European powers expanded their influence across the globe, they were transforming the opium trade from a relatively small-scale affair into an enormous international industry. And nowhere would the consequences of this transformation be more devastating than in China. The story of the Opium Wars is one of the darkest chapters in the history of European colonialism, and it is essential to understanding how morphine and its derivatives would eventually become global problems. The British East India Company, that vast commercial enterprise that functioned at times as a quasi-governmental entity, controlled enormous poppy-growing regions in Bengal in northeastern India. The poppies grew easily in the fertile plains, and peasant farmers, often under considerable coercion, cultivated them in vast quantities. The raw opium was processed in company factories where it was tested for purity, weighed, packaged, and prepared for export. But export to where? Britain already had its domestic laudanum market, but that alone could not absorb the output of the Indian plantations. The company needed a larger market. It found one in China. China had its own history with opium, but consumption had traditionally been limited. In the early 18th century, the Qing dynasty had prohibited opium smoking, recognizing its potential for harm. But the British traders, operating through complex networks of smugglers and corrupt officials, flooded China with Indian opium despite the ban. The trade was enormously profitable. It also solved a problem that had long frustrated European merchants. China produced silk, tea, porcelain, and other goods that Europeans desperately wanted, but China wanted very little that Europe produced. Opium balanced the trade, as Chinese silver flowed out of the country to pay for the drug. By the 1830s, China was in crisis. Perhaps 2 million of its citizens were addicted to opium. Silver was draining from the economy at alarming rates. The social fabric, particularly in coastal regions, was fraying. Emperor Daoguan was desperate. He sent Lin Zexu, a capable and incorruptible official, to Canton to suppress the opium trade. Lin took aggressive action, confiscating and destroying more than 20,000 chests of opium, over 1,000 tons of the drug. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her conscience, asking how Britain could justify inflicting upon China a substance that was banned within Britain itself. The letter went unanswered. Britain's response was not diplomatic, but military. In the First Opium War from 1839 to 42, British naval and military forces humiliated the Qing dynasty. China was forced to cede Hong Kong, to pay massive indemnities, and to open ports to foreign trade. The opium continued to flow. A second opium war in the 1850s resulted in further concessions. By the latter half of the 19th century, opium addiction had become endemic in China, affecting perhaps 1 in 10 adult males. The century of humiliation, as Chinese historians call this period, began with opium, and the national memory of this trauma persists today. But while empires fought over opium, a quiet revolution was taking place in a German pharmacy. A young assistant, barely out of his teens, was about to unlock opium's most powerful secret. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm Serturner, and the year was 1804. The town was Paderborn, in what was then the Prussian region of Westphalia. Serturner worked as an apothecary's assistant, preparing medicines according to physicians' prescriptions. He was curious, self-taught in chemistry, and frustrated by the inconsistency of opium preparations. Different batches of the raw drug seemed to have wildly different potencies. Patients sometimes received too little to help. Other times they received dangerously too much. Serturner believed that opium must contain some single active principle, some specific substance responsible for its effects. If he could isolate that substance, he could create preparations of reliable, predictable strength. Patients could be dosed precisely. The dangers of accidental overdose would be reduced. Working alone with primitive equipment, often late at night after his regular duties were completed, Serturner began a series of experiments that would change the world. He dissolved opium in acid, precipitated it with ammonia, collected the crystalline residue. He tested the resulting substance on stray dogs, on mice, on himself and 3 young friends. What he found was remarkable. A relatively tiny amount of his purified substance produced far more powerful effects than a much larger dose of raw opium. The principle he had isolated, he calculated, was at least 10 times more potent than opium itself. In 1805 and 1806, Serturner published his findings in an obscure German journal. He called his new substance Principium Somniferum, the sleep-making principle. But the scientific world took little notice. His papers were ignored, dismissed, forgotten. For more than a decade, Serturner continued his work in relative obscurity. He refined his isolation methods. He conducted more experiments. And in 1817, he published again, this time in a more prominent journal, with more detailed evidence and a new name for his discovery. He called it Morphium, after Morpheus, the god of dreams. This time, the world paid attention. Joseph Louis Gay-Lussac, one of the most respected chemists in Europe, read Serturner's paper and was impressed. He brought the work to the attention of the broader scientific community. The French adopted the name Morphine, and it spread from there. Serturner was awarded prizes and recognition. He had achieved what no one before him had managed, the isolation of an active principle from a plant. This was not merely a pharmaceutical achievement, it was a conceptual revolution. For the first time, scientists understood that the complex effects of medicinal plants were due to specific chemical substances that could be separated, purified, and studied. Serturner had opened the door to modern pharmacology. In the decades that followed, chemists would isolate caffeine from coffee, quinine from cinchona bark, cocaine from coca leaves, and scores of other compounds. All of this flowed from Serturner's lonely experiments in Paderborn. But if morphine was more powerful than opium, it was also more dangerous. The margin between an effective dose and a fatal one was narrower. The potential for addiction was, if anything, greater, and Serturner himself would learn this painful lesson. He began taking morphine regularly for various ailments. He found that he could not stop. In his later writings, he warned of the drug's dangers, describing it as a terrible gift and cautioning physicians to use it with the utmost care. He died in 1841, his final years clouded by bitterness and, almost certainly, by continued dependence on the substance he had discovered. The second chapter reveals how morphine moved from the laboratory into medicine and commerce, becoming one of the most important and profitable drugs of the 19th century. In 1827, the German chemical company E. Merck began commercial production of morphine. Heinrich Emanuel Merck, who transformed his family's apothecary shop into an industrial pharmaceutical enterprise, recognized the potential of Sir Turner's discovery. He standardized production methods, ensured consistent purity, and marketed morphine to physicians throughout Europe. Other companies followed. By the middle of the century, morphine was available from numerous manufacturers in forms suitable for every purpose: powders, pills, solutions, suppositories. It was prescribed for almost any painful condition, for coughs and diarrhea, for melancholy and nervous disorders, for the restlessness of children and the sleeplessness of adults. It was legal, available without prescription in many places, and seen as a tremendous advance over the crude and unpredictable opium preparations of the past. But morphine had a limitation that frustrated physicians. It had to be given by mouth, and the digestive system absorbed it slowly and incompletely. Much of the drug was destroyed before it could reach the bloodstream. For patients in severe pain, this delay could seem endless. The solution to this problem arrived in 1853 when two men working independently developed the hypodermic syringe. Alexander Wood was a Scottish physician practicing in Edinburgh. He was treating a patient with neuralgic pain and wanted to apply morphine directly to the affected nerve. He reasoned that injecting the drug through the skin rather than administering it orally would allow it to act more quickly and locally. He developed a syringe fine enough to penetrate the skin and experimented with subcutaneous injection. The results were dramatic. Morphine delivered by injection acted within minutes rather than hours. The doses needed were smaller, since none of the drug was lost to digestive degradation. Patients experienced relief almost immediately. Wood published his results and promoted his method enthusiastically. He also made a fateful assumption. He believed that because the drug was not passing through the stomach, it would not be habit-forming. Addiction, he thought, was somehow related to oral ingestion. Injection would avoid this problem. He was tragically wrong. His wife, Rebecca, became one of the first known victims of intravenous opioid abuse. She died in 1894, almost certainly from an overdose. At roughly the same time that Wood was developing his syringe in Edinburgh, Charles Gabriel Pravatz in France was creating a similar device for injecting other substances. The combination of Pravatz's precision engineering and Wood's medical application resulted in the hypodermic syringe as we know it today. Within a decade, the devices were being manufactured commercially and sold to physicians throughout Europe and America. The hypodermic syringe transformed morphine from a powerful medicine into an almost magical one. Physicians could now offer patients virtually instant relief from even the most excruciating pain. Surgery became easier, more humane. Battlefield medicine was revolutionized. The syringe and the morphine it delivered became symbols of medical progress, of humanity's growing power over suffering. But what came next would shock the world. The American Civil War began in April of 1861, and it would become the bloodiest conflict in American history. More than 600,000 soldiers died over the 4 years of fighting, and hundreds of thousands more were wounded. The weapons of the era, particularly the Minié ball, a conical bullet that shattered bones and tore through flesh with devastating efficiency, caused injuries of horrific severity. Military surgeons, overwhelmed by the scale of casualties, reached for every tool available to ease their patients' suffering. Chief among these tools was morphine. The drug was issued in massive quantities to Union and Confederate armies alike. Surgeons used it before, during, and after operations. It was given for wounds, for dysentery, for the fever and weakness of camp diseases. Soldiers in terrible pain were offered the oblivion of injection, and they accepted gratefully. But when the war ended, something unexpected happened. Hundreds of thousands of veterans returned home to find that they could not stop using morphine. They had become addicted in the hospitals and camps, their bodies now dependent on the drug. They wrote desperate letters to their former surgeons, begging for supplies. They sought out pharmacies that would sell them what they needed. Some turned to crime, others simply wasted away. This phenomenon became known as the soldier's disease or the army disease. Some historians have debated how widespread it truly was, arguing that contemporary accounts may have exaggerated the numbers. But there is no question that the American Civil War introduced morphine addiction to American society on a scale never before seen. It also created, for the first time, a public awareness that morphine might be as much curse as blessing. Similar patterns emerged in Europe. The Franco-Prussian War of 1770 to 1771 saw extensive use of morphine by military surgeons, followed by a wave of addiction among veterans. The Prussian medical establishment, with characteristic efficiency, documented the phenomenon and began to study it scientifically. Yet despite growing awareness of the dangers, morphine use continued to increase. In the latter decades of the 19th century, the drug became more available than ever. It was included in countless patent medicines, those proprietary preparations sold directly to the public with extravagant claims of curative power. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed for teething infants, contained morphine. So did Dover's powder, a popular treatment for colds and fever. Godfrey's cordial, a preparation for children, had been used for generations. Now it was reformulated with morphine for greater potency. Manufacturers rarely disclose the contents of these medicines. A mother giving her fussy baby a spoonful of soothing syrup had no idea she was administering an opioid. A gentleman taking a dose of tonic for his nerves did not know he was courting addiction. The patent medicine industry operated with almost no regulation, and it profited enormously from public ignorance. Moving into the late 19th century, we find a society awash in morphine, yet only beginning to understand the consequences. In 1874, in a laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London, a chemist named C.R. Alder Wright performed an experiment that would have devastating consequences. He was searching for a non-addictive alternative to morphine, and he tried combining morphine with various acids. One of his experiments involved heating morphine with acetic anhydride, a process called acetylation. The result was a new compound, diacetylmorphine. Wright tested it on animals and found that it produced effects similar to morphine, but more intense. He published his findings, but they attracted little attention. The substance sat on the shelf, a laboratory curiosity, for more than 2 decades. Then, in 1897, the German pharmaceutical company Bayer took notice. Bayer was already famous for aspirin, the revolutionary pain reliever it had developed from willow bark. Now it was looking for other breakthrough drugs. A Bayer chemist named Heinrich Draeser rediscovered Wright's compound and tested it on himself and on workers in the factory. The results seemed promising. diacetylmorphine appeared to be an excellent cough suppressant, better than codeine, the opium derivative, than in common use. It also seemed to make test subjects feel powerful, capable, heroic. In German, heroisch. Bayer named the new drug heroin. Beginning in 1898, Bayer marketed heroin as a safe, non-addictive substitute for morphine. The company sent samples to physicians worldwide. It advertised in medical journals. It promoted heroin as a treatment for coughs, for asthma, for tuberculosis, and crucially, for morphine addiction itself. Patients dependent on morphine, Bayer claimed, could be weaned off by switching them to heroin. The medical profession, by and large, believed these claims. Heroin was prescribed liberally. Patients were switched from morphine to heroin and assured they were being cured. For a few years, the new drug was hailed as a breakthrough. But heroin, as any modern reader knows, is actually more potent and more addictive than morphine. It crosses into the brain more quickly, producing a more intense rush. The dependence it creates is even harder to break. Within a few years, reports of heroin addiction began to appear in medical literature. By 1910, the truth was undeniable, and Bayer quietly stopped promoting its wonder drug. But the damage was done. Heroin was now loose in the world, manufactured by companies other than Bayer, smuggled across borders, sold on streets. It would become in the 20th century a symbol of everything dark and destructive about opioid drugs. Yet morphine itself remained central to medicine. Even as heroin's reputation collapsed, physicians continued to prescribe morphine for legitimate purposes. The drug was indispensable for surgery, for cancer pain, for injuries of every kind. The challenge that confronted the medical profession and society at large was how to preserve morphine's benefits while controlling its dangers. In the United States, this challenge produced the first major federal drug legislation. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required manufacturers to list the ingredients of their products, ending the era of secret formulas. For the first time, Americans could know if the medicine they were buying contained morphine, heroin, cocaine, or other potent substances. Patent medicine sales declined sharply as consumers learned what they had actually been taking. But disclosure alone was not enough. In 1914, Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, which required the registration and taxation of those who imported, manufactured, or distributed opiates and cocaine. Physicians could still prescribe these drugs for legitimate medical purposes, but they had to keep careful records. The act was not technically a prohibition, it was framed as a revenue measure. Yet in practice, enforcement authorities interpreted it as banning maintenance prescriptions for addicted patients. Doctors who continued to supply morphine to addicts, even as a humane effort to prevent withdrawal, were prosecuted and imprisoned. This represented a fundamental shift in American policy. Addiction, which had been seen as a medical condition or a personal failing, was now criminalized. The addicted were no longer patients to be treated, they were criminals to be punished. This approach would dominate American drug policy for a century and more. How did we reach this point? How did a substance once seen as God's gift to suffering humanity become the target of criminal law and moral condemnation? The answer lies partly in who the addicts were. In the late 19th century, the typical American morphine addict was, somewhat surprisingly, a middle-aged, middle-class white woman. These women had become addicted through legitimate medical treatment, through the soothing syrups and cordials of the patent medicine era. through physicians who prescribed morphine liberally for menstrual cramps, nervous disorders, and the vague ailments then gathered under the label of hysteria. These addicts were largely hidden. They maintained respectable households. They did not commit crimes or cause public disturbances. Their addiction was seen as pitiable but not threatening. But by the early 20th century, the demographics of addiction were changing. New immigrants, particularly from Asia, were associated in the public mind with opium dens and degeneracy. Young men in cities were injecting heroin. Addiction was becoming visible, frightening, associated with poverty and crime and racial minorities. The same addiction that had inspired sympathy when it afflicted respectable housewives inspired fear and disgust when it touched populations that elite America already mistrusted. This racial and class dimension of drug policy would persist throughout the 20th century with devastating consequences for communities of color. But that is a chapter of our story that lies ahead. First, we must turn to the great conflicts that reshaped the world in the 20th century and the role that morphine played in them. The First World War, which erupted in 1914 and raged until 1918, was the most destructive conflict humanity had yet experienced. New weapons, machine guns and artillery and poison gas produced casualties on a scale that shocked even generals accustomed to carnage. More than 17 million people died. Tens of millions more were wounded, many with injuries that would have been rapidly fatal in earlier conflicts. Those wounded soldiers survived in many cases because of morphine. Military surgeons injected the drug freely, far more freely than their civilian counterparts might have. A soldier with a shattered leg, lying in a field hospital within sound of the guns, could be given enough morphine to render his pain tolerable while doctors worked to save his life. Morphine made it possible to treat wounds that otherwise had been untreatable, to transport the injured from battlefield to hospital, to perform surgeries that otherwise would have been impossible. But the war also created new populations of addicts. Soldiers who had received morphine for wounds continued to crave it after their wounds healed. Some obtained supplies illicitly. Others turned to the heroin that was becoming increasingly available in post-war Europe. The problem was recognized, but largely ignored. Governments had more pressing concerns in the chaotic aftermath of the conflict. The interwar period saw growing international concern about the drug trade. The League of Nations, that precursor to the United Nations, attempted to coordinate international drug control. Treaties were negotiated, though enforcement was sporadic. The production and trafficking of opiates continued largely unchecked. Then came the Second World War, a conflict even larger and more destructive than the first. Once again, morphine proved indispensable. Military medical kits included morphine syrettes, single-dose syringes pre-filled with the drug that medics could administer to the wounded on the battlefield. The small tubes, shaped like toothpaste tubes with attached needles, could be used even by untrained soldiers to inject themselves or their comrades. The D-Day invasion of Normandy in June of 1944 was perhaps the largest single use of morphine in history. As Allied soldiers stormed the beaches under murderous German fire, medics worked frantically to save the wounded. They emptied their supplies of morphine almost immediately. Many soldiers who survived that day did so in part because morphine allowed them to endure their injuries long enough to receive treatment. But the war also saw morphine used for purposes that had nothing to do with healing. Morphine overdose became a method of euthanasia for the hopelessly wounded. On both sides of the conflict, medics sometimes gave fatal doses to soldiers whose injuries were too severe to treat, whose suffering could not otherwise be relieved. These mercy killings were rarely acknowledged and never officially sanctioned, but they happened. Morphine, the drug of relief, became also the drug of death. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the addiction patterns of earlier conflicts repeated themselves. Veterans returned home dependent on morphine or heroin. The illicit drug trade, disrupted by the war, reconstituted itself. New trafficking networks emerged, connecting opium-growing regions in Southeast Asia and the Middle East to consumers in Europe and America. The third chapter of our story takes us through the middle decades of the 20th century, an era of growing crisis. In the 1950s, morphine and heroin addiction in America was concentrated in urban areas, particularly among African American communities in northern cities. This was not coincidental. The Great Migration had brought millions of Black Americans from the rural South to cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit. There, they faced discrimination, poverty, and limited opportunity. The despair of the ghetto made addiction more likely. The concentration of addicts in specific neighborhoods made drug enforcement easier and more visible. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by the zealous Harry Anslinger, pursued a policy of strict criminalization. Anslinger, who had previously led the campaign against marijuana, turned his attention to opioids with equal fervor. He promoted harsh mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. He opposed medical treatment for addiction, insisting that the only appropriate response was punishment. But not everyone agreed. Some physicians and public health officials argued for a different approach. In Lexington, Kentucky, the federal government operated what was officially called a hospital, but functioned more as a prison where addicts were confined for mandatory treatment. The Lexington facility provided detoxification, counseling, and vocational training. It also provided researchers with a captive population for experiments on addiction and its treatment. At Lexington, scientists confirmed what observers had long suspected. Addiction was not merely a failure of willpower, but a physical condition. The brain changed in response to chronic opioid exposure. Withdrawal was not just unpleasant, but medically serious, sometimes dangerous. Recovery was possible, but relapse was common. These findings pointed toward a medical approach to addiction rather than a purely punitive one. Yet the punitive approach prevailed. In 1956, the Narcotic Control Act increased penalties for drug offenses to among the harshest in the federal code. First-time possession of heroin could result in up to 10 years in prison. Selling heroin to a minor could carry the death penalty. America was waging war on drugs, and casualties mounted on all sides. As we approach the modern age, the story of morphine becomes increasingly complex, intertwined with social movements, cultural shifts, and medical advances. The 1960s brought upheaval to every aspect of American society, and drug policy was no exception. A new counterculture embraced recreational drug use as a form of rebellion and consciousness expansion. While the drugs of choice for young white middle-class Americans were typically marijuana and psychedelics, heroin also found new populations of users. The Vietnam War, which escalated dramatically in the mid-60s, created a new addiction crisis, eerily similar to those of earlier conflicts. American soldiers in Vietnam had easy access to high-quality heroin produced from the opium poppies of the Golden Triangle, where the borders of Laos, Thailand, and Burma meet. A vial of heroin that would cost $20 on the streets of New York could be purchased for $2 in Saigon. Some estimates suggested that 10 to 15% of American servicemen in Vietnam used heroin. When these soldiers came home, many brought their addictions with them. But remarkably, the majority of those who had used heroin in Vietnam stopped using it upon their return. Studies by researcher Lee Robbins found that only about 5% of soldiers who had been addicted in Vietnam became re-addicted in America. The environment, it seemed, mattered enormously. Remove the stress and trauma of combat, remove the easy availability and social acceptance of the drug, and most users could walk away. This finding challenged the conventional understanding of addiction as an inexorable progressive disease. It suggested that social and environmental factors were at least as important as the pharmacology of the drug itself. But this nuanced understanding struggled to penetrate public policy, which remained focused on prohibition and punishment. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, which reorganized federal drug law and created the scheduling system still in use today. Heroin was placed in Schedule I, reserved for drugs with high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. Morphine was placed in Schedule II, acknowledging its legitimate medical applications while subjecting it to strict controls. The act also created the framework for what President Richard Nixon would call a war on drugs. Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one and increased federal funding for both enforcement and treatment. For a brief period, treatment actually received more resources than enforcement, and methadone maintenance programs expanded dramatically. Methadone, a synthetic opioid developed in Germany during the Second World War, had been discovered to have a remarkable property. It could satisfy the craving for heroin without producing the intense high. Patients stabilized on methadone could function normally, hold jobs, maintain relationships. They were still physically dependent on an opioid, but they were no longer trapped in the destructive cycle of buying, injecting, and seeking more heroin. Vincent Dole, a physician at Rockefeller University in New York, and Marie Neiswander, a psychiatrist, pioneered methadone maintenance treatment in the 1960s. Their work demonstrated that addiction could be managed, if not cured, through medical means. Thousands of patients were enrolled in methadone programs with generally positive results. But methadone maintenance was controversial. Critics argued that it simply substituted one addiction for another. Some in law enforcement saw it as enabling drug use rather than fighting it. Religious and moralistic objections were raised. After Nixon's resignation in 1974, federal support for treatment waned, and the emphasis shifted back toward enforcement. The 1980s brought a new drug crisis, crack cocaine. This inexpensive, smokable form of cocaine devastated urban communities, and the public response was one of fear and outrage. Harsh new laws imposed mandatory minimum sentences for crack offenses, sentences dramatically more severe than those for powder cocaine. These disparities had a pronounced racial impact, as crack was more common in black communities, while powder cocaine was favored by white users. The focus on crack somewhat diverted attention from opioids, but heroin had not disappeared. The drug remained available in every major American city, its users now predominantly older addicts who had begun using in earlier decades. The AIDS epidemic, which emerged in the 1980s, revealed that injection drug users were at extreme risk of HIV transmission as they shared needles and syringes. The AIDS crisis forced a reconsideration of some drug policies. Needle exchange programs, which provided clean syringes to drug users, were established in some cities, despite controversy. The argument that keeping addicts alive was more important than punishing their drug use gained traction, at least in some quarters. In the 1990s, several developments set the stage for what would become the opioid epidemic of the following decades. First, attitudes toward pain management were changing in the medical profession. For years, doctors had been criticized for undertreating pain, for leaving patients to suffer unnecessarily out of fear of addiction. New guidelines encouraged more aggressive pain treatment. Pain was declared the fifth vital sign to be assessed and addressed as routinely as pulse or blood pressure. Second, new opioid formulations were coming to market. Pharmaceutical companies promoted these drugs aggressively, assuring physicians that the risk of addiction had been overstated. A new era of opioid prescribing was beginning. Third, the pharmaceutical industry was becoming more powerful and less scrupulous. The influence of drug company money on medical education, research, and prescribing practices was growing. Physicians were wined and dined, paid as consultants, showered with gifts. The line between science and marketing was deliberately blurred. Into this environment stepped Purdue Pharma, a privately held company controlled by the Sackler family. Purdue had already made substantial profits from MS-Contin, a control-release morphine formulation. Now it was developing a new drug, one that it believed would be even more successful. OxyContin, a semi-synthetic opioid, chemically similar to morphine but somewhat more potent orally. It had been used for decades in combination products like Percodan and Percocet. OxyContin was different because of its control-release mechanism, which was supposed to release the drug slowly over 12 hours, providing steady pain relief with only twice-daily dosing. Purdue marketed OxyContin aggressively. The company spent hundreds of millions of dollars on promotion. It employed an army of sales representatives who visited doctors' offices, distributed branded merchandise, and made claims about the drug that would later be proven false. The central claim was that OxyContin was less addictive than other opioids because of its slow-release formulation. Patients, Purdue suggested, were unlikely to become addicted because the drug did not produce the immediate high associated with faster-acting drugs. The FDA approved labeling that stated the delayed absorption was believed to reduce abuse potential. This claim was false. OxyContin's controlled release mechanism could be easily defeated by crushing the pills, which allowed the entire dose to be absorbed at once. Users who snorted or injected the crushed pills experienced a powerful high comparable to heroin. Word spread quickly among drug users, and OxyContin became a drug of abuse. Purdue knew this was happening. Internal documents, later revealed in litigation, showed that the company was aware of widespread abuse within the first few years of OxyContin's release. Sales representatives reported that doctors were being sought out by drug seekers. Law enforcement agencies reported surges in OxyContin-related crime. Communities, particularly in rural areas where jobs had disappeared and hope was scarce, were being devastated. But the company did not pull back. Instead, it pushed harder. Sales continued to grow. By 2001, OxyContin was Purdue's best-selling drug, generating more than $1 billion annually. The human cost was staggering. In the coal country of Kentucky and West Virginia, in the Rust Belt of Ohio and Pennsylvania, in small towns throughout America, OxyContin was destroying communities. Doctors were overwhelmed by patients seeking prescriptions. Some physicians became pill mills, writing prescriptions indiscriminately in exchange for cash. Pharmacies in certain areas dispensed more opioids than those in much larger cities. Addiction spread with terrifying speed. Young people became addicted after injuries, after surgeries, after taking pills from their parents' medicine cabinets. When they could no longer obtain prescription opioids, or when the cost became prohibitive, many turned to heroin, which was cheaper and increasingly available. The transition was seamless. All opioids activate the same receptors in the brain. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of decisions made decades ago. In 2007, Purdue Pharma and 3 of its executives pleaded guilty to federal charges of misleading the public about OxyContin's addiction risk. The company paid more than $600 million in fines, but no one went to prison, and the Sacklers, who had extracted billions of dollars from the company over the years, faced no personal consequences. The epidemic continued to worsen. In 2010, Purdue introduced a reformulated OxyContin that was harder to crush, a change that was both welcomed and criticized. It did reduce abuse of OxyContin specifically, but many users simply switched to heroin, which remained plentiful and cheap. Then came fentanyl. This synthetic opioid, developed in the 1960s for surgical anesthesia, is approximately 100 times more potent than morphine. Legitimate fentanyl has important medical uses, particularly for cancer pain and in operating rooms. But illicitly manufactured fentanyl, produced largely in Chinese laboratories and smuggled into the United States through the mail and across the Mexican border, began to appear in the heroin supply. Fentanyl's potency made it enormously profitable for traffickers. A kilogram of fentanyl has the same psychoactive potential as 100 kilograms of morphine. It also made it deadly. Doses varied wildly. A batch that seemed safe could be followed by a batch that killed instantly. Overdose deaths surged. In 2017, more than 70,000 Americans died from drug overdoses, the majority from opioids. In 2021, that number exceeded 100,000 for the first time. Life expectancy in the United States, which had been rising steadily for decades, began to fall, driven in significant part by opioid deaths among young and middle-aged Americans. The epidemic was not confined to the United States, though it was most severe there. Canada experienced a parallel crisis, particularly in British Columbia, where fentanyl flooded the illicit drug market. Australia, the United Kingdom, and Western Europe saw smaller but significant increases in opioid-related harms. How did humanity arrive at this point? How did morphine, that crystalline gift of the poppy, become the instrument of so much suffering? The answers are multiple and overlapping. The human desire to escape pain, physical and emotional, is universal and eternal. The pharmaceutical industry's pursuit of profit overwhelmed its obligations to safety. Regulatory agencies were captured by the industries they were supposed to oversee. Social and economic despair created fertile ground for addiction. The healthcare system failed to offer alternatives to opioid painkillers. Criminal justice policies made treatment harder to access and addiction more shameful to acknowledge. Yet, morphine itself and the broader class of opioids remain indispensable to medicine. Patients with cancer, with severe injuries, with painful terminal illnesses require these drugs. The World Health Organization estimates that tens of millions of people worldwide lack adequate access to opioid pain relief, suffering needlessly because of overly restrictive policies or inadequate healthcare systems. The challenge is not to eliminate opioids, but to use them wisely, to balance the relief of suffering against the risk of addiction. Modern medicine has developed tools that Friedrich Serturner could never have imagined. Medication-assisted treatment with methadone, buprenorphine, and other drugs can help addicted individuals stabilize their lives and reduce the risk of overdose. Naloxone, an opioid antagonist, can reverse overdoses if administered quickly enough. It has saved countless lives and is now available over the counter in many places. Research continues into non-opioid pain treatments, including drugs that work on different pathways in the nervous system. Yet, the crisis continues. The supply of illicit opioids has not diminished. Stigma still prevents many people from seeking treatment. The social and economic conditions that foster addiction remain largely unaddressed. Progress is being made, but it is slow, and the toll of lives lost mounts daily. The story of morphine is, in the end, a story about the limits of human wisdom. We found a substance of extraordinary power, a key to unlock the cage of pain. We used it enthusiastically, sometimes wisely, often not. We created industries and policies and cultures around it, and those institutions developed their own momentum beyond any individual's control. We are still living with the consequences. Looking back across the centuries, from the Sumerian joy plant to the modern opioid epidemic, we see patterns that repeat themselves with discouraging regularity. Each generation discovers opioids anew, is amazed by their power, and only gradually learns their dangers. Each generation believes it has found a safer form, from laudanum to morphine to heroin to OxyContin, only to discover that the fundamental nature of these drugs cannot be engineered away. And yet, human beings continue to need relief from suffering. A mother with cancer needs morphine to make her final months bearable. A soldier wounded in combat needs morphine to survive. A person in the grip of addiction needs treatment, not punishment, to find a way back to health. The poppy has been part of human civilization for more than 5,000 years. It will remain so. The question is not whether we will use opioids, but how we will use them, how we will balance the incredible good they can do against the terrible harm they can cause. There are no easy answers, but the search for those answers, the attempt to learn from our long history with these substances, may be the best hope we have. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, consider this. The same chemical pathways that make morphine and its relatives so effective for pain are also the pathways that produce our natural sense of well-being, of connection, of pleasure in ordinary life. Opioids hijack these ancient systems, producing effects more intense than any natural stimulus could. Perhaps what the opioid epidemic reveals is not merely a failure of regulation or a triumph of greed, but something deeper about the human condition. We are creatures who crave ease, who flee pain, who long for oblivion. These longings are woven into our biology. They cannot be legislated away, or preached away, or punished away. The story of morphine is, finally, a story about us, about what we will sacrifice for relief from suffering, about the bargains we make with chemicals that promise paradise. It is a story without a neat ending, without a clear moral, without an easy resolution. It is a story that continues even now in hospitals and homes and streets across the world. Someone is receiving morphine for the first time tonight, perhaps for a legitimate medical need, perhaps to quiet some deeper ache. Someone is entering treatment, taking the first painful steps toward recovery. Someone is mourning a child lost to addiction. The poppy grows as it has for millennia. The white sap oozes from the scored pod. The ancient chemistry continues its work. And we, as a species, continue to wrestle with the gift and the curse, the blessing and the bane. The God of dreams still waits, arms open, ready to receive those who seek his embrace. Whether that embrace brings healing or oblivion, comfort or destruction, depends on choices we make, individually and collectively, every day. Sleep now. Rest. Tomorrow the story continues, as it always does, as it always will, for as long as human beings know pain and long for relief. The night is quiet, the darkness is soft, and somewhere in a field far away, the poppies are blooming. Let them bloom, and let us learn at last to tend them wisely.